31:48-53.1 If Jonathan had shot only one arrow, the boy might have guessed that it served as a signal, but by shooting 3 arrows, Jonathan led the boy to think that he was just practicing shooting point 2. Friendships are one of the most enriching of life's experiences. How poor is the man or woman who is friendless? Friends enrich life because they give, without counting the cost. Jonathan was a man who gave to David more than he received, and in doing so he showed how different he was from the typical king described in 8:11-17, whose sole function was to take. Life has its givers and its takers. Jonathan was supremely a giver, and David, though destined to become a king, persistently declined to take anything away from Saul. He patiently waited for God to give him the crown of Israel. 3. Saul's anger over David's absence 20:24-34. Saul concluded at first that David had not come to the new moon sacrificial meal because he was unclean. Cf. Leviticus 7 verses 20-21, 15-16. His continued absence on the second day required an explanation, which Saul looked to David's friend Jonathan to provide. Saul hated David so much he could not bring himself to use his name. Verses 27-31. The son of v30 was a mild insult. Cf. 10:11.4 By insulting Jonathan's mother, Saul was intensifying his insult. v30. Today's English version translated Saul's epithet, "You bastard." The New Jerusalem Bible rendered it, "You son of a rebellious slut." The note in the Net 2 Bible says, "You stupid son of a bitch." Jonathan had chosen David as his friend to his own shame, v30, in the sense that, because he had made him his friend, rather than killing him, as Saul wanted him to do, David would take. One for discussion of a minor textual problem in verse 23, see Amuna Finkelstein, and ignored haplography in Samuel, Journal of Semitic Studies 4:4, October 1959 356-57. 2G. R. Driver, Old Problems Reexamined. Zeitschrift für die Alttestamentliche Wissenschaft 80, 1968 177. Sumira, page 514. 3 David Payne, page 106. For Youngblood, page 723. 158 Dr. Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 2024 edition. Jonathan's place as the king of Israel. That would be a shame for Jonathan. Jonathan had chosen David to the shame of his mother's nakedness, in that Jonathan's conception and birth were useless if David replaced him. Jonathan would fail to achieve the purpose for which he had been born, in Saul's way of thinking. v. 31. Saul perceived David as a threat to his continuing dynasty, not just to his personal rule. Clearly Saul was rejecting and opposing God's will that his reign and his dynasty would not endure. Saul said he would kill David so that David could not do what God had said he would do. Jonathan's ambitions were not the same as Saul's. He wanted God's plans to succeed more than he wanted to become Israel's king. Therefore, he interceded for David again. v. 32, cf. 19:4. Saul, exasperated by what he interpreted as Jonathan's selfless folly, tried to execute David's advocate as he had formerly tried to kill David himself. v. 33, cf. 1811, 1910. This brush with death finally convinced Jonathan that David had been right about Saul's intentions after all. Cf. v. 3. It also convinced him to get out of the king's presence. Jonathan departed in hot anger because of Saul's attitude toward David and because of Saul's attitude toward himself. Saul had said David would not allow Jonathan to rule, but Saul himself almost prevented that from happening by attacking the crown prince. Jonathan's departure from Saul's table symbolized his departure from his father's fellowship. David's final departure from Gibeah 20:35-42. The next morning, Jonathan proceeded to communicate Saul's intentions to David in the way they had previously planned. Jonathan probably used a very young boy as his arrow retriever so the lad would not ask embarrassing questions or figure out what was happening. God permitted David and Jonathan to say goodbye face to face. They had anticipated that such a parting might be impossible. Cf. 2022. David gave proper respect to Jonathan as the king's son, even though they were best friends. V 41. Saul's rebellion against God's will had made their companionship impossible. They parted, reminding themselves of the commitments they had made to each other and to their descendants. V 42. Cf. verses 16, 23, 2 Sam 9. David and Jonathan decided not to see each other again for their mutual protection, but cf 23:16-18. 2024 Edition Drive Constable's notes on 1 Samuel 1:59. This chapter reveals that both Saul and Jonathan realized that David was the Lord's anointed who would one day replace Saul. However, their responses to this inevitable situation were opposite, because their desires were opposite. Saul wanted to see his own plans fulfilled, but Jonathan wanted to see God's will done. Jonathan ended up choosing David, his natural rival, in preference over Saul, his natural father. His sister Michal had made the same choice. David later kept his covenant with Jonathan, 2 Samuel 9 verse 1, showing that he was a covenant-keeping individual similar to Yahweh. This is another evidence that David was a man after God's own heart, 13:14. The main character in this pericope is Jonathan. His attitude to God's will contrasts positively with Saul's attitude. Rather than opposing God's will and his anointed, as Saul did, Jonathan humbled himself before God's will and supported the Lord's anointed, David. Jonathan faced a terrible tension since Saul's attitude divided Jonathan's loyalty. He solved this problem by putting God's will first. He submitted to the domestic authority of his father and to the civil authority of his king by obeying Saul, except when obedience to Saul conflicted with obedience to God. Cf. 1 Peter 2 verses 13 to 17. C. David in Exile CHS 21:31. In chapters 21-30 we see David's forces growing stronger and stronger while Saul's forces get weaker and weaker. This is a further demonstration of the fertility theme. However, these chapters also develop the motif of the proper response to Yahweh's anointed. These chapters are highly instructive for us for two reasons. First, they help us see how the difficulties that God permitted David to experience refined his character and prepared him for the throne. Cf. Heb 12. Second, these chapters illustrate the sovereignty of God in working out his plans for both Saul and David. They help us see how God works and uses the choices people make to accomplish his will. Interesting, too, are the parallels between David's experiences as the Lord's anointed and Jesus Christ's as the Lord's anointed. Rejection preceded acceptance, and suffering preceded reigning in both cases. God blessed both of these servants personally, and they became a blessing to others because of their commitment to Yahweh and his law. 160 Dr. Constable's notes on 1 Samuel 2024 edition. The true servant of God must willingly suffer affliction with the full assurance that God is performing his purposes. Positions of prominence and prestige are not to be sought and worked for. Rather, the leader who desires Christ's blessing must wait patiently on him for advancement and promotion to opportunities of greater service. 1. Several of the Psalms have their backgrounds in these chapters. P.S. 18, 34, 52, 54, 56, 57, 63, 124, 138, 142, and possibly others. 1. David's initial movement CHS 21:22. The two chapters comprise a literary unit of 3 sections arranged in chiastic order. Chapters 21:1-9 and 22:6-23 are concerned with the priestly compound at Nob in Benjamin, while the central section, 21:10-22:5, summarizes David's flight to Gath in Philistia, Adullam in Judah, and Mizpah in Moab. 2. David's flight to Nob 21:1-9. Nob stood 1½ miles northeast of Jerusalem and 2½ miles southeast of Gibeah. It stood on what is now called Mt Scopus. There Ahimelech lit. My brother is king, served as high priest. Ahimelech was the brother of Ahijah, who had joined Saul as his spiritual advisor after Samuel withdrew his services. 1 Saul 14:3, cf 22:9. For that reason, David was unsure whether to trust Ahimelech and decided to make up a plausible story to account for the fact that he was on his own. 3. David probably supposed, like many other persons, that a lie is quite excusable which is told for the sole purpose of saving the speaker's life. But what is essentially sinful can never, from circumstances, change its immoral character, and David had to repent of this vice of lying. Psalms 119 verse 29, 4. 1 Tucker, page 159. 2 Youngblood, page 727. 3 Baldwin, page 137. For Jameson, et al., page 221. 2024, Edition Drive Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 161. Priestly activity, and evidently the tabernacle, were now at Nob, cf 1754. Since Ahimelech, otherwise known as Ahijah, or perhaps the brother of Ahijah, cf 1 Samuel 14 verse 3, 22:9, was the great-grandson of Eli, it is reasonable to assume that either his father Ahitub or he himself had removed the tabernacle from Shiloh and installed it at Nob. One can only speculate as to why the site was selected. The ark, of course, still remained at Kiriath Jearim in the custody of the family of Abinadab. 1. It is significant that David's first place of refuge was among God's chosen representatives on earth, the priests. He wanted to get help from the Lord through them, cf 22:10, as he had done in the past, 22:15. Apparently Ahimelech was trembling because David was alone, cf 16:4. Had Saul sent him to harm the priests, cf 22:6-23, or was David in some kind of trouble? David was Saul's general, and as such he usually traveled with escorting soldiers. According to verse 1, David was alone. No one was with him. But according to Matthew 12 verses 3-4, Mark 2 verse 26, and Luke 6 verse 4, David had his men with him. Apparently David entered Nob and met Ahimelech alone, but his men were close by at a certain place, v2. Then his men joined him, and they ate the consecrated bread together. Verses 4-6. David appears to have lied to Ahimelech, v2. However, he may have been referring to Yahweh when he mentioned the king who had sent him, cf. 2022, 21:8. Even so, he wanted Ahimelech to think that Saul had sent him. This was deception at best and a lie at worst, rooted ultimately in selfishness and lack of faith in God. David made some mistakes in his early years as a fugitive, but he handled himself better as time passed. During this time, God was training him for future service. David proceeded to explain that the reason he was alone was that he had sent his soldiers elsewhere, v2. He intended to summon them shortly and had come to Nob, initially by himself, to obtain provisions, protection, and prayer, cf. 22:10. Ahimelech gave David the showbread that the priests ate, Exodus 25 verse 30, Leviticus 24 verses 5-9. This was the bread that for a week lay on the table in the tabernacle. Each Sabbath the priests replaced this bread with fresh loaves. 1 Merrill, Kingdom of, page 215. 162 Dr. Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 2024 edition. Ahimelech was careful that David's men were ritually clean, not having had sexual relations with women that day, v4, cf. Leviticus 15 verse 8, Exodus 19 verses 14-15. David assured him that their bodies were clean ritually, v5. This made it permissible for them to eat the consecrated bread. Ahimelech correctly gave David the provisions he needed, v6. Jesus said this was proper for David to have done when his critics criticized his disciple for eating the heads of grain from a grain field on the Sabbath, Matt 12:1-4. The reason was that human life takes precedence over ceremonial law with God. 1 David was probably not at the point of starvation. Certainly the Lord's disciples were not. Nevertheless, meeting a human need should always trump the observance of a ritual used to worship God. Christians acknowledge the same priority today. Suppose you pass a house that is on fire. You stop, run up to the front door, bang on the door, and ring the doorbell. You look in the window and see someone lying on the floor. You then kick in the door and drag the unconscious person outside to safety. Even though breaking into someone else's house is a criminal offense, the law will not prosecute you, since you saved that person's life. The mention of Dog, whose name may mean fearful, an Edomite who had risen high in Saul's government, v. 7, prepares the reader for his informing Saul about what happened at Nob, which comes later in the narrative, 22:9-19. Josephus called Dog, by birth a Syrian, one that kept the king's mules. 2. Dog may have been a proselyte or an Israelite who had lived in Edom, or one of the captives that Saul had brought into Israel from Edom, cf. 1447. Point 3, perhaps Dog was detained before the Lord v. 7, because he had come to the tabernacle to present an offering or to conduct some other business there. Having previously requested provisions from Ahimelech, v. 3, David now asked for protection, namely a sword, v. 8. Goliath's huge sword, which had initially rested in David's tent, 1754, was now in the tabernacle wrapped in a cloth with the priest's ephod, perhaps because it was considered to be a historic relic. David eagerly accepted it from Ahimelech, since there was none like it, v. 9. It had no equal. It is interesting that David, and later Solomon, used the same expression to describe the Lord. 1 CF. F. Bruce, The Hard Sayings of Jesus, page 33. 2 Josephus, 6:12:1, 4 and 6. 3 Davis, In a History, pages 235-36. 2024, Edition Drive Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 163. 2 Samuel 7 verse 22, 1 Kings 8 verse 23. Though there was no better protection than Goliath's sword physically, the Lord was an even better protector spiritually. There is none like him. David's flight to Gath 21:10-15. David's next refuge also proved to be insecure. It is a mystery why he sought refuge with Goliath's sword in that giant's hometown. As Chuck Swindoll once said, David would have been as conspicuous in Gath as Dolly Parton in a convent. Evidently, he thought he would be welcome in Gath since he was fleeing from Saul. Perhaps he went there since Achish was an enemy of Saul's, as David was. Gath was also the Philistine town closest to David's hometown, Bethlehem. Abimelech may have been the title of the king of Gath, who is called Achish in the superscription of Psalm 34, or Abimelech may be the Semitic form of the Philistine name Achish. 1. The people identified David at once and called him Israel's king, v. 11. This may have been a slight on his authority. They may have meant that he was only a local ruler, cf. Josh 12:7. Alternatively, they may have heard of David's anointing as Israel's next king. In any case, Achish's advisors viewed David's presence as a threat, v. 11, cf. 29:1-5. Perhaps they felt like the American president might have felt if a high-ranking Russian general defected and sought asylum in the United States during the Cold War. The potential of his helpfulness against the enemy had to be weighed against the chance that he would prove disloyal, turn on his host, and do much damage. David sensed his personal danger and pretended to be insane to save his life. Evidently, Achish dismissed him as a threat, concluding that David was mad and could be of no help to him or Saul, cf. 29:3, 6, 9, ps. 34 title, where Achish is called Abimelech. Ancient Near Easterners typically regarded the insane as harbingers of evil and so avoided them. They felt it was bad luck to kill a madman. 2. Insanity was often believed in the ancient world to be an affliction of the gods, and it was customary to treat madmen. 1 Ibid, page 236. 2 Merrill, 1 Samuel, page 219. 164 Dr. Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 2024 edition. As taboo if not holy, people who should not be harmed in any way. 1. In both Nob and Gath, David resorted to deception to protect himself, and in each case some bad consequences resulted. Doeg killed the priests, and David had to abandon Gath. However, David also trusted in the Lord. He wrote Psalms 56 and 34 during and after his time in Gath, according to the titles of those psalms. They reveal that he was trusting God. His ultimate hope for provision and protection was not the priests or Saul's enemies, but the Lord himself. This faith undoubtedly explains the fact that God preserved him, and some good consequences came out of these experiences, especially that David survived them. David had 2 more encounters with Achish, both of which were beneficial for David. 1 Samuel 21 helps us see the mixture of right and wrong in David's actions, but David's psalms clarify the proper response that the godly should make when opposition assails them. David's flight to Adullam 22:1-2. The town of Adullam, lit, refuge or closed in place, stood a mile or 2 south of the Elah Valley, where David had slain Goliath, and about 10 miles east-southeast of Gath. It was halfway between Gath and Bethlehem. There are many huge caves in the limestone hills in that area, several of which can accommodate over 400 people. Evidently, David's family was no longer safe from Saul in Bethlehem, which was 10 miles east-northeast of Adullam. David composed Psalm 142 at this time. If Saul would attack his own family, 20:33, there was no telling what he might do to David's. 2. David now became the leader of a group of people who, for various reasons, had become discontented with Saul and his government and were passionate for change. The original mafia. They all had one thing in common, a bad record. They were so tough they'd make Al Capone sleep with a nightlight. They were gross. Anybody who got near that. 1 David Payne, page 113. C.F. Merrill, Kingdom of, page 216. Hans Hertzberg, I and 2 Samuel, p. 183. 2 Gordon, I and 2 Samuel, page 172. 2024, Edition Drive Constable's notes on 1 Samuel 165. Gangstade is quiet as a roomful of nuns. They had a quaint name for those who crossed their paths. Victims, 1. One cannot read verse 2 without reflecting on how needy people later sought, and now seek, refuge in David's greatest son, Jesus Christ, cf. Matt 11:28, John 7 verse 37. This growing movement of support behind David led eventually to his coronation as king of all Israel. David's flight to Moab 22:3-4. Moab was a reasonable place for David's parents to seek protection since David's great-grandmother, Ruth, was a Moabitess. Like the town of Gath, the country of Moab was one of Saul's enemies, cf. 1447. The ruler of Moab would have been willing to support anyone who could weaken Saul. The exact location of Mizpah, lit. Watchtower of Moab is unknown. David may have wanted to secure the support of the Moabites since he could use help from neighboring kingdoms if Saul's antagonism led to full-scale war. The stronghold, V4, was probably another name for Mizpah or another place close to it in Moab. David's flight to the forest of Hereth 22:5. Gad appears to have been a prophet who remained with David throughout his reign, cf. 2 Samuel 24 verse 11. God provided another prophet through whom he communicated to the king-elect other than Samuel. The forest of Hereth was somewhere in the tribal territory of Judah, but its exact location is unknown. Point 2. Saul's slaughter of the priests 22:6-23. The writer's attention focused next on Saul's activities. He used the literary device of focusing on David, then on Saul, then on David, etc. He used the same technique in chapters 1-3 with Samuel and Eli's sons, in order to contrast Samuel's goodness with the wickedness of Hophni and Phinehas. The same purpose is in view in chapters 21-31 with David and Saul. 1 Swindle, come before, page 145. 2 on the alternate reading, David had departed, v. 6 CD, Winton Thomas, a note on Noda in 1 Samuel XXI. 6. Journal of Theological Studies 21:2, October 1974 01-2. 166 Dr. Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 2024 edition. Saul was aware that some in his army, apparently even some of his tribal kinsmen from Benjamin, had deserted to David v. 7. By referring to his servants as Benjamites, lit. Sons of Benjamin, Saul revealed that he had a rather narrow power base. Point 1 Saul showed signs of paranoia when he claimed that Jonathan had encouraged David to ambush him. Verses 8-13. There is no indication that Jonathan had done this. Doeg was obviously loyal to Saul, verses 9-10, but he proved disloyal to Yahweh, verses 18-19. This event is the historical background of Psalm 52. Ahimelech appealed to Saul on David's behalf, much like Jonathan had done earlier, verses 14-15, cf 17:4-5. Nevertheless, this time Saul did not respond to reasonable persuasion, v. 16. Saul's disregard for Yahweh's will is obvious in his command to kill the priests, whom God had appointed to serve him. This punishment was entirely too severe, since the crime Saul charged them with was simply failing to tell Saul where David was. Saul's soldiers had too much respect for the priesthood to slay the anointed servants of the Lord, v. 17, cf 14:41-46. Moreover, they probably realized that Saul's order was irrational. Doeg was an Edomite, a foreigner who obviously had less respect for the Mosaic law, cf 21:7. He not only obeyed the king, but went beyond Saul's command and slaughtered all the men, women, children, and animals in Nob, v. 19. The Mosaic law prescribed that it was illegal to put children to death for the sins of their parents, which Doeg did here, v. 19. Deuteronomy 24, verse 16. Nonetheless, Saul was also responsible, v. 21. Earlier, Saul had failed to slay all the Amalekites at the Lord's command, 15:9. Now he was slaying all the Nobites without divine authorization. Point 2. Saul treated Nob like some enemy city that had been put under the ban, cf 15:3. Saul is becoming a classical Near Eastern king, falling into the pattern against which Samuel warned, 8:10-17. 4. The text says that Doeg killed 85 priests, but Josephus wrote that he killed Ahimelech and all his family, who were in all 380. 1 Firth, page 241. 2 Miscall, page 136. 3 Simura, page 546. For Firth, page 243. 2024, edition Drive Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 167. 5. 1 The Septuagint also has 385. In another place, Josephus wrote that Saul slaughtered 300 priests and prophets on this occasion, as if he were endeavoring in some sort to render the temple, tabernacle, destitute both of priests and prophets. 2. God preserved one of Eli's descendants, even though 85 other priests died. This man, Abiathar, v. 20, fled to David, so from then on the priesthood was with David rather than Saul. David acknowledged that his deception of Ahimelech was responsible for the slaughter of the priests, v. 22, cf 21:2. As partial atonement for his act, David became the protector of the priesthood. The king-elect and the priest-elect now became fellow fugitives from Saul. Psalm 52 provides insight into how David felt during this incident. When people refuse to submit to God's authority over them, they begin to deteriorate, spiritually, socially, psychologically, and physically. Romans 6, verse 23. Eli and Saul had both refused to submit to God's authority. Eli, the priest, put his family before God. Consequently, God cut off his family. Even though David was the cause of 85 priests' deaths, this was one way God partially fulfilled the prophecy concerning Eli's descendants, 2:27-36. God used David's folly to accomplish his will. So even in this, David became a blessing. This in no way justifies David's lie, 21:2, but it does show how even in his sinning, David was used by God for blessing. Cf. Psalm 76, verse 10, Romans 6, verses 1-2. Saul, the king, put himself before God. He became increasingly paranoid, isolated from others, hateful even toward his supporters as well as his enemies, and guilty of shedding innocent blood. God ended his life prematurely. Conversely, when people submit to God's authority over them, they really begin to thrive. John 10 verse 10. David submitted to God's authority over him. His sins, including deceiving Ahimelech, bore bad consequences for himself and others. Nevertheless, God continued to bless and use David. He blessed him personally. David continued to rise to the throne. God also blessed him by using him to accomplish God's will. Hear the pruning of Eli's descendants. Therefore, we conclude that the most important issue is one of long-term authority, not incidental acts. Acts are important, but who is in control, God or self, is even more important. For a believer, the most important issue is authority. Believers can determine who is in control of our lives. 1 Josephus 6:12:6, 2 Ibid 6:12:7. 168 Dr. Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 2024 edition. Fairly easily by asking ourselves two test questions. Do I ask God for guidance, or do I ignore him and make my own plans and decisions without praying? And do I submit to his word, or do I disobey it, having ignored it or disregarded it? 2. Saul's pursuit of David's age 23. The literary spotlight now moves back from Saul to David and his activities. As Saul's disregard for God's law increased, David's submission to the Lord increased. We have just witnessed how Saul, in an outburst of rage, became responsible for the destruction of the priestly city of Nob. In Ch 23, David, even while on the run from Saul, is shown saving a city from Philistine attack. 1. What is most notable is that the self-interest demonstrated in 21:2-16, English translation 21:1-15, has receded, and the concern for others at which 22:1-5 hinted has not become apparent. 2. In the second chapter of his book Up from Slavery, Booker T. Washington wrote, I have learned that success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which he has overcome while trying to succeed. Measured by this standard, and it's a valid one, David was a very successful man. 3. David at Keilah 23:1-14. David went to rescue the people of Keilah from the Philistines, but then he had to flee from that town because the citizens were going to hand him over to Saul. David's rescue of Keilah 23:1-5. Keilah was about 3 miles southeast of Adullam in the Shephelah, the foothills between the coastal plain on the west and the hill country of Judah. 1 Gordon, IN 2 Samuel, page 175. 2 Firth, page 249. 3 Wiersbe, page 269. 2024, Edition Drive Constable's Notes on 1 Samuel 169. On the east, the Philistines were plundering the threshing floors there. The threshing floors were places where the Israelites stored their threshed grain after threshing it, as well as places where they threshed it. Cf 2 Kings 6:27, Joel 2 verse 24. David sought to defend his countrymen and fellow Judahites from their hostile foreign enemy, even though he was also watching out for Saul at the same time. Saul should have come to their rescue, since he was the king, but there is no mention of him doing so. The writer recorded in this passage that David inquired of the Lord 4 times, verses 2, 4, 10, 11. He placed himself under God's authority, though Saul did not. For this reason, God could and did work through David as his vice-regent. God manifested his will through the Urim and Thummim in the priestly breastpiece on his ephod, verses 6, 9. Cf. Exodus 28 verse 30. The Urim, lit. Lights and Thummim, lit. Perfections were evidently 2 stones or similar objects, one light and the other dark in color. The high priest carried them in the pocket on the front of his ephod apron. He ascertained God's will by drawing one out after mentally assigning a meaning to each. Evidently Abiathar, lit. The Great One, his father, interpreted the will of God for David. David was not just defending himself during this period of his life. He was aggressively carrying out the will of God by defeating Israel's enemies as the Lord's anointed servant. God told David to go against the Philistines first. Then, in response to David's second prayer, he promised that he, emphatic in the Hebrew text, would give the Philistines into David's hand. David's men were understandably afraid to attack the Philistines, who had greater numbers and stronger forces. Nevertheless, David attacked and soundly defeated the Philistines because of God's promise and power. The writer gave credit to David for the victory, v. 5, but clearly it was God who enabled him to win against such a daunting foe, v. 4. David's escape from Keilah 23:6-14. Abiathar had evidently remained in the forest of Hurath, 22:5, when David took his men to attack the Philistines in Keilah, cf 22:20-23. Now the priest joined David at Keilah v. 6. The presence of the ephod made it possible for David to continue to obtain guidance from the Lord in answer to his prayers. Saul piously claimed that God had delivered David into his hands, v. 7. Obviously God had not done this, since David was the Lord's anointed king. 170 Dr. Constable's notes on 1 Samuel 2024 edition. Elect. God did not want Saul to hunt him down, much less kill him. Keilah evidently had only one gate by which people could enter and exit the town. Saul felt confident that he could control the gate and so trap David. Saul summoned soldiers to accompany him to Keilah, v. 7, but there's no mention that he prayed for divine guidance, as David had done, verses 2-4. David prayed again and requested answers to two questions, verses 10-11. He opened and closed his prayer with an appeal to the Lord God of Israel, the ultimate ruler of his people. He also described himself as the Lord's servant twice, verses 10-11. David voiced concern for his men, v. 12, as well as for himself, v. 11. God gave the answer to David's second question first, and then he answered his first question. The willingness of the people of Keilah to hand their savior over to Saul demonstrates faith and gratitude for David's deliverance of them. It also reveals how fearful they were of Saul, who had recently destroyed another town, Nob, for harboring David, 22:19. From their standpoint, David had gotten them into much more trouble than he had saved them from. 1. David left Keilah after he learned that he would be vulnerable if he stayed there, v. 13. He did not take revenge on the citizens of Keilah for telling Saul where he was. Saul had taken revenge on the citizens of Nob for not telling him where David was. The number of David's supporters had grown from 400, 22:2, to 600, v. 13. More people were siding with David and were turning away from Saul. Saul abandoned his plans to attack Keilah, and David moved on to the wilderness near Ziph. David in the wilderness of Ziph 23:15-23. David had sought and received divine guidance and had succeeded at Keilah, verses 1-14. Now Saul sought and received human guidance and failed near Ziph, verses 15-23. Jonathan visited David to encourage his friend in this wilderness, cf. John 3 verse 30, but David had to flee again because the inhabitants of Ziph also threatened to betray him. 1 Samuel, page 556. 2024, Edition Drive Constable's notes on 1 Samuel 171. Jonathan's encouragement of David 23:15-18. The town of Ziph, refinery, was 12 miles southeast of Keilah, and the wilderness of Ziph was near the town. Ziph stood in the wilderness area of Judah, whereas Keilah was in the more hospitable Shephelah. The sites of Horish, v. 15, and Hachilah, v. 19, are not certain. The name Horish means the wood. Jonathan risked his own safety to encourage his friend again. God had used Abiathar to encourage David recently in Keilah, v. 6. Jonathan encouraged David in God, v. 16, cf. 30:6. What he said to David rested on God's promises and plans for David, which both Jonathan and Saul now knew, cf. 20:2, 31. Jonathan's humility stands out in his statement that David would become king and that he would be second in command to you. V. 17. Unfortunately, Jonathan died before David became king, but he would have made a much better second in command than Joab proved to be. Jonathan cooperated with God's plans, but Saul resisted them. It is curious that Jonathan could find David, but Saul and his intelligence experts could not locate him. God was protecting his servant. Jonathan and David made another covenant, probably recommitting themselves to their former pledges to one another. V. 18, cf 18:3, 20:8, 12-17. This is the last meeting of these soul brothers that the text records. David's escape from the wilderness of Ziph 23:19-23. Again, the writer directed the reader's attention back to Saul. Psalm 54 tells us what David was thinking and praying during this experience. He trusted in God. Evidently, the Ziphites thought that they would be better off if they informed Saul of David's presence in their area than if the king discovered that he was there. He might have blamed them for sheltering David and taken revenge on them as he had on the people of Nob. Again, Saul spoke piously, CFV 7, and praised the Ziphites for having compassion on him. Really, it was David who was in need of compassion from these people, but he found none. Saul proceeded to seek human help in finding David from his allies. Go, be more persistent, investigate, see, look, learn, return. Verses 22-23. However, there is no mention of his seeking divine help in prayer, cf. verses 2